Yeah, let's talk about it all. Why not? As you know, I'm not like fully doxxed. I'm pseudonymous. I always get that one wrong. It's such a hard word to say.
Yeah. Pseudonymous. Yeah, I say it enough.
Pseudonymous. There we go. We got it on the third try. So I go by Toady Hawk on chain and have pretty much since I first came on chain. Prior to being a very on chain person, I guess I can just sort of give a little bit of background. I studied journalism at university and never practiced as a journalist, which is kind of interesting given a lot of the things I'm working on these days. But yeah, I studied as a journalist, kind of saw the writing on the wall, as it were, when I was in school, that this was not a great career to train for. Even at that time, this would have been like, late early 2000s. And so I could kind of see that there just wasn't a lot of opportunity in that space. And that proved out to be the case. Like just at that point, everybody was a blogger. Everybody was starting, social media was becoming bigger and news was coming from a lot of different places and not from centralized sources anymore. And so as a career, for better or worse, spoiler alert, it was for worse. Journalism as a career just hasn't been a great path for most people. So I started dabbling in business at that time. I started my own business in second year of university. Just doing like services in the neighborhood. Like I was literally like painting people's houses and like mowing their lawns and stuff, just like essentially doing my own thing instead of going to work for someone else. And I found that I really liked that. And so after school, I ended up going into business for myself as well. And for about 20 years, I had various businesses that were mostly consulting around marketing, go to market, these types of things, some graphic design. So just kind of dabbled and self-taught a lot of things and had a pretty successful run with several companies here locally. And that was all before I kind of fell down the crypto rabbit hole, as it were. And, I find, first of all, I want to say like, this is interesting to me being on the other side of the microphone because I'm usually interviewing people and not being interviewed. So I apologize if I'm like a rambling, terrible interview, but I'll try my best to keep it interesting for the people tuning in. But one thing I notice when I'm on the other side of the microphone is that people's stories often have this like hinge on the COVID days and like the before times and the after times. And that was definitely, that held a lot of truth for me too. Just like COVID kind of hit our area hard and like my wife was home from work and like my work slowed down in a lot of ways. So just had a lot of time to reflect and whatnot. And that's kind of when I discovered crypto, as it were. Funny enough, my introduction to crypto, or the one that actually grabbed me and made me sort of sit down and start learning about it more, was Michael Saylor. I saw an interview with him on some news network or something, or somewhere I was watching, and he was talking about why he decided to basically, go all in on Bitcoin with MicroStrategy, which I guess now is just strategy. And at that time, I was like, I could do that too. Like I've got some, we have some cash flow in our business that we don't need right away. Like, why don't I put that into Bitcoin as well? So that was one of my first moves, is like I put some of my company's money into Bitcoin in early 2020. And that ended up being a very, good decision to make. And that kind of hooked me and got me interested into learning more about it. And, learned about Ethereum, learned about how you could actually do things with Ethereum and how it was like, digital oil in a way, like it powered all these interesting experiments. And so I got really hooked by that. And then in 2021, I was, really active in the NFT side of things. Top Shot was a big part of my journey. It was one of the first sort of NFT products that I explored. And then I was in all the froth. For anyone who was around during 2021, the summer of 2021 going into the fall, was just a crazy time where anybody could make a 10K PFP project with, choose any animal at the zoo, and you could you could mint out 10,000 in an hour and make a bunch of money. And it was just crazy and frothy and nuts. I remember buying a pudgy penguin and then reselling it for buying it for 0.2 ETH or something and reselling it for 5 ETH, a week later, and thinking I was a genius. Meanwhile, of course, Pudgy went on to go on a crazy run. So first of many chances to fade generational wealth. But yeah, that got me interested. But then I kind of got like burnt out by it after a few months. I'm like, this is interesting. It's cool. It's neat to see so many people excited about this tech, but it's also just kind of like a lot. Like if you were in those discords, it was a grind, and there wasn't a lot of community building going on. It was just kind of like a glorified casino. And that's when I minted Cryptoads, as an NFT that I saw some interesting people minting on the timeline. I was a fan of Gremplin's art, and so when I saw he was doing an NFT project, I'm like, that's really cool. So I checked it out. I minted. I think I only minted one of those, and then I bought more later. But I really loved the aesthetic, and I jumped in the Discord, and it was so different than other projects at the time. Like anyone who remembers that time, it was so frothy, so crazy. Everyone was like when moon all the time in every Discord. But if you went into the Cryptoads Discord, it was literally just people typing vibe, 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 vibe for like, days on end, and everyone was just really chill. So like I saw that there could be like a different type of community built around NFTs. And that's when I saw the power of NFTs as this sort of community building technology in a way. I don't know if that makes sense as a way, but so yeah, that was my sort of entry into, a deeper form of on-chain life, I guess you could say. And then from Cryptoads is where I kind of discovered Nouns, and we could go on from there, but I'll pause to catch my breath.
Yeah, no, it's a great story. And I can, it's funny you mentioned like sort of not being on the other side of the mic. I tend to do the same thing on the other side of the mic as a guest, and like end up talking like a lot and super fast. But like, I think that's the right way to be as a guest personally. Like I end up doing that sometimes as a host too. But I feel like when I'm listening, like, if you're listening to a podcast, you hear the host talk all the time. You want to hear the other person talk. So anyway.
There's always that cringe period where you're like doing your editing and you're like, oh my God, shut up, Toady. Like,
Well, so I'll tell you, I don't really do editing. That's sort of my secret. I just keep it like, I looked at Joe Rogan and I was like, this guy is the most popular podcast in the world, and there's seemingly no editing. So, why do I have to do editing? Like, I kind of hate editing, and I really just like jumping on and having the conversation. And I used to spend a lot more time preparing as well, which I do really enjoy, like just sort of really researching a person and understanding what they're working on, and trying to put myself in their shoes and think about, what are they most interested in? What do they like talking about? Where do they have sort of unique perspective and insights that I couldn't really get from anyone else in the world potentially? But recently I've been going with a little bit more like sort of the spontaneous thing, because I found with some less prepared conversations that I had that sometimes they ended up being almost better in like a different way. And for me, just sort of working on some other things right now and doing the podcast more is just like a side thing for fun. It's more practical to sort of have the more spontaneous type of conversation. So
I found that as well. Actually, I've had that same thought before. Like my sort of like OCD tendencies won't let me go into a podcast recording without doing some research, because I'm just too worried about like looking like a fool. But I have found that the times that I have come in a little more raw, you do let the guests talk more. You let them sort of tell their own story, and so there's definitely benefits to both ways, I think.
Yeah, and I definitely sympathize with what you just said on like sort of the feeling prepared. It's basically like when I first started recording podcasts, I was like, man, like what if I just don't have anything to say? And it's like this like really daunting fear of like, man, that would be so embarrassing or like just like ridiculous. Like I'm a podcast host, I have like nothing to say. But like in reality, it just like doesn't happen. Like the worst case scenario is like sort of you don't immediately know what exactly. Like you don't really have something to say basically, but like you will say something. Like it's same as just like regular conversations in the real world, and might not be.
Sometimes there's really awkward chemistry though. Like I won't name any names, but there's been a few times that I've recorded with people, and like one time my wife was like in the next room listening, and she came in after. She's like, "That was really awkward, right?" I'm like, "Okay, thank you for making me feel sane," because I like weren't laughing at any of my jokes, which is fair. They're not always that funny, but sometimes there's just no chemistry. You're like, God damn, like. What do I got to say to get this guy?
Yeah, I've recorded like this is I don't know where I'm at exactly, because like I said before we started rolling, I'm like sort of combining a couple of podcasts, but I think overall podcasting I've done like approaching 250, and I know like I haven't had one in so long that
I'm clapping for you because I know how much work that is.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, so less if you don't do a bunch of editing, but still a lot of work for sure. And so anyway, so I've done a bunch of these, and what was I going to say? The on the sort of like awkward chemistry thing. Like I actually haven't had one so long. I can't really even sort of remember who they are exactly, but I remember like sort of at least one. And I think basically like in the history, I've had like at least two. It's not so much that it was like awkward, because to your point, like chemistry, like it's not necessarily hit or miss. It's like a spectrum. There could be like more or less, and usually there's like it's at least sort of like fine. But I've had like 2 episodes ever that were like kind of brutal. And like I posted them anyway, but I was like, man.
In your opinion or in like general opinion?
One of them I didn't really hear feedback on. It was just sort of like run of the mill in terms of popularity. I just thought it was kind of brutal, but like it was fine. No one really cares. The other one, funny enough, was like became one of my. I won't say who it is, but became one of my most popular episodes of all time. Like top five. And part of
That's funny.
it wasn't brutal in the sense that like basically the guy's just a dick. And that was just sort of like his thing.
Okay.
And I don't know, it's hard to say. Very different guy. Like he just sort of has his own set of beliefs, just very different from normal people. And
Like, I'm trying to guess who this is. I'm gonna be going through your catalog after this. We're gonna have to set
yeah.
up like a pay-per-view mini app thing where find out Toady and Jake's worst guests, pay $1.50.
Yeah. So and like to be fair, like I actually, in the end, like I appreciated the conversation. Like it was fine. I just felt like almost embarrassed by like he was like intentionally awkward. Like he would just you could say something and he'd be like, yeah, I don't think that's an interesting question. Like something
Yeah.
like that, which is like, oh, like, this is kind of tough. But
Yeah.
it was all right. So anyway, sort of jumping around here, but I'm curious, like you mentioned at the top, pseudonymity and operating under the name Toady Hawk since you basically started
You
in
just have to nail
crypto.
that word on first try, right? Just to clown me.
Yeah. I just, it's smooth and I could do it again. Pseudonymity, I'll just keep doing it. But like when you have to say it back, if you could stumble over it a little bit like the previous time, that'd be perfect and make me look good probably. And maybe
Never
a
say
little
it
bit
again.
smarter. Yeah,
I'll
make it
never
a
say it
little,
again on the air.
yeah, exactly. So, anyway, I've been operating pseudonymously. There we go again on the internet. Perfect pronunciation. And I've been doing it since I started on the internet, which was like roughly the same time I started in crypto. And like obviously I was, using the internet prior, but I'm talking about like, for lack of, basically like sort of the Chris Dixon whole thing about like not even like the own part with crypto, but just like reading the internet versus writing. Like I feel like prior to 2019, I was pretty much just reading.
You were a lurker.
Exactly. And like not even like I wasn't really there's like sort of this different thing, I guess, beyond writing and reading or reading versus writing or whatever, which is like sort of closed versus open networks, if you will. And like so I was on Instagram posting with like my, high school friends or college friends or whatever, and I was on Snapchat and stuff like that. I wasn't on TikTok I don't think was really around then, and I'm still not on TikTok, but Twitter is sort of the main one. Like I wasn't on Twitter. Maybe I had an account for some years or whatever, but I definitely wasn't like super active or doing anything really useful. And I was never posting or anything like that. And then basically 2019 started a blog. Quickly after that started, created a Twitter, and then quickly, several months after that started the podcast. And like at that point, you're writing, you're tweeting, you're podcasting, like you're fully on the internet. And then I was also doing some crypto stuff. And so like that was sort of when I started. And when I did that, I went like blue dot and the name Jake and nothing else. And so there's enough Jakes in the world that you can't guess which one I am without a last name or seeing my face. And so that was sort of like
Where did the blue dot come from?
the blue dot was basically I started the blog like somewhat on a whim. I had been thinking about it for a while and finally decided to act. And I'm just a big believer in like you need to do something quickly and like not overthink it or else you might never do it. And so I sort of finally had like the impetus to do it and felt like I needed sort of like a logo. And in the spirit of making something quick and sort of like simple and minimalist, sort of like how I like to do things, I was like, blue is my favorite color and circle is my favorite. It's not really my favorite shape. I just thought it was sort of like the most fundamental shape, maybe like a square or something, but I kind of like the circle. So I did the circle, and I've sort of like retroactively actually applied like different meanings to it. But in the beginning, it was like kind of as simple as that. It was like something quick that I could make. And I also thought that if you could become, I like to be a little bit different as well. Like a lot of logos are, anything compared to just a blue dot is going to be busy. And so in a world of busyness, simplicity stands out. And then lastly, along those lines, I thought like, well, if I could sort of become, if I could sort of do well enough that like people see the blue dot and like they think of me, like I've kind of won. And like you could do that with like, some like obscure logo, but it's not as like, I feel like if you could do that with like a very simple logo, it's like, oh, blue dot is Jake, then that's like really cool. So that's
when we launched the Yellow Collective last year in January, we kind of had a similar idea about just trying to own the yellow circle emoji, and that's done pretty well mimetically. So
yeah.
I think there's something strong to just like a color,
Yeah, owning an emoji is a really good idea. Like I didn't have that thought when I started. But definitely
luckily there is
like
one. There is
yeah, there is one. It's not
base,
like my
base kind of took it.
Yeah, exactly. Base has been commandeering my blue dot for years, and I'm kind of
no royalties, no on-chain royalties.
No on-chain royalties, and I feel like and I'm out here like building and hustling hard on base too. It's like maybe they took my blue dot, maybe I should go to Solana or something like that.
You heard it here first.
Yeah. No, I'm not actually going to leave.
That should solve everything. It's worked really well in the past.
Yeah, no, I like building on base. All jokes aside, but I'm also not like a maximalist. I like I've done stuff on Solana as well, not as big for as long, but just played around and whatever. And besides, those kind of seem like the only two games in town right now. I'm sure there's there's other stuff, but in terms of building and then in terms of investing, all over the board. But anyway, I was going to ask like, so you're like sort of, it's different from what like, people don't know my last name. People don't know what I look like. People do know what you look like, but they don't know your name. What's like the
weird
thought
blend.
on, what's on the, like, it's pretty uncommon, right?
I think so. Although, well, there's others like that, I think too. But for me, it's just for fun, maybe for a little bit for security. But it's not super serious. I'm not trying to be like the Anon founder of a crazy protocol or anything like this. It's just mostly for fun. The name itself, has a bit of fun lore to it. I mentioned that Cryptos was the main collection that really got me kind of falling all the way down the rabbit hole with NFTs and Ethereum, and just living on chain. And my first toad was this crazy toad that I minted with an orange mohawk. And so at one point Gremplin posted a thread when cryptos were popping off, and he was like, post below the lore of your toad and I might draw it or something like this. And so I made up like on the spot the lore around this toad being Toady Hawk, gave him a skateboard. I used to play a lot of Tony Hawk back in the day, and that's where it came from. And then it just kind of like I liked it. I loved that NFT. I used it as my PFP. It just kind of like morphed into me over time. So that's the backstory on Toady Hawk.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's nice, like you sort of go for, like I was saying with the blue dot, or in this case, you with Toady Hawk, like you sort of start something. It's almost like an accident, or at least you don't like sort of to play like, this is going to be my thing for like so many years or whatever. But
yeah, it's not real lore. It's not real lore unless it's accidental, right?
Exactly. I know like an interesting one, obviously we were just talking about base, like I know Coinbase, or at least I've heard, I think in the story that like basically Coinbase in the early days, like I think Brian was trying to think of a name and he had some certain like sort of criteria that he wanted, maybe like 2 syllables or something. And like basically Coinbase was like not something, I don't remember the exact story, but like he was kind of like, okay, we'll go with it for now. And then like, here we are, and it's in the S&P 500.
It's so funny because it's such a perfect name too, and how like they've split the two sides of the business, like the coin side being the SEX, and then the base side being the Ethereum L2. It's just kind of, it's kind of perfect in a way.
Yeah, I thought I misheard you, and I didn't know what you were saying when you said sex there, and then I realized you're talking about a decentralized exchange.
Yeah, new sex scandal with
I was like, what's going on at Coinbase again? No, it's funny. So then can we sort of take the next step there to Nouns? Was Nouns, so this was after Cryptoads?
Yeah, so in the Cryptoads Discord, actually, I saw this guy just drop a project. He's like, I'm launching tomorrow, and I checked out the Twitter, and it was for this project called Noun Punks, which actually had really dope art. They were basically like kind of a blend of punks and nouns, and they all had nouns glasses. Really cool art. The guy had obviously taken a lot of time on the project, but I saw that he had like 35 followers or something like this on Twitter, and he was about to launch a collection of 10,000. So I sent him a message. I was like, bro, like these are really cool. Like I can help you with this, but like you can't launch tomorrow. Like you have 35 followers. You can't launch a 10,000 PFP project. And he's like, oh man, I've just been working on these for so long. I just want to get them out. So long story short, he ends up trying to launch them the next day. Of course, it flops because nobody even knows they exist. Tree falls in the woods and all that. And then he reaches out back to me and he's like, okay, like this didn't go well. Can you kind of try to help me salvage the situation? So I ended up volunteering to help this project for a couple of weeks and like try to get some hype. Like I said before, my background is in sort of marketing and I did a lot of social media marketing. So I kind of put some of that stuff to work and tried to get some hype. And eventually after a couple of weeks, we got a couple like big names to buy and it popped off and it minted out. So this was like maybe a month later. It minted out, kind of like at that time, if a project minted out, it usually got a lot of hype. It built a community. It was a kind of a crazy time actually.
Right.
So Noun Punks, blew up. The guy basically offered me a job to like be their community manager full time. At that time, I had been falling steadily down the crypto rabbit hole and taking fewer and fewer contracts in the meat space over about the course of a year already at that point. So I kind of just like took the leap and I was like, hey, let's just try this and see if it's really possible to sort of actually make money in this on-chain space. And so I stopped taking contracts in the meat space and I just went full-time crypto at that point. And this would have been early 2022 because Nouns came out in 2021 August, so this would have been like early the next year. And so that's how I got involved with Nouns, is through this project Noun Punks, and I worked with that project for a while. I started working a lot with Seneca and his prop house team, who I met through Noun Punks. I started getting more involved with Nouns when they launched this project, which still exists, called Nounsol, which was like the idea being that it would be like all builders who are working on different things in the Nouns ecosystem could come together and like debate props and whatnot when Nouns was really active at the time. So I was one of the founding members of that. So just kind of kept getting more and more interested in Nouns. I loved the idea of just a headless brand and like coming from that space where like, brands are always like very intentional and top down and everything, it just kind of blew my mind. Like, how could this decentralized organization, and Nouns is like a truly decentralized organization for people who aren't familiar, like through its history, it's really had all sorts of different cohorts who have affected its emergent kind of value sets, etc. So how could this like emergent organism of a DAO have a cohesive brand of any kind? And that experiment like was really attractive to me, and that's I think why I kind of fell in love with Nouns and ended up building in the Nouns universe. Still am to some extent for like 2+ years after that.
Yeah, and so I think we might have touched on this a little bit, like on Farcaster and a couple casts, but basically like put a pin in it to talk about later. And now we're talking. So, what is your like general sense of what's going on with Nouns, like in basically like in recent times, like this year or whatever sort of time frame makes sense? And like part of the context, for why I ask is obviously like I'm working on a daily auction project now, and it's just like I mean like Nouns like obviously just like completely crushed it out of the park, doing genuinely novel things, more than one, and it's still like by many sort of like however you want to sort of look at it, it's been like an incredible success, but it's just so hard when
Still
something
exists.
has
There's that.
of course. I mean that's sort of
4 years later and it's this,
and more than that, I mean, the daily auctions are still going for like 2 ETH, I think, last I checked. And like,
not quite that much anymore, but
it's like super legit. And so basically like, even when you can basically look at a project like that and it's like, man, these guys like completely knocked it out of the park. And, obviously like you talk about, it's not really like a team as much as a decentralized collective of people, but like they, basically best case scenario and still like not a ton of, like basically single digit bids on the auctions, even though they're high prices. And like I understand sort of like a group with some sort of like motive that's sort of like bidding up a lot of these, trying to get like some share of all of the Nouns or whatever for like certain advantages on the voting. So like I just am curious to like sort of, I don't know if it makes sense to talk about what's going on now or if there's some backdrop that is helpful, but like consider me someone who like I know the broad strokes on Nouns, but I'm not like deep in the weeds or anything like that. Just to hear like sort of what's going on, was there anything preventable?
Okay, let me try.
Or
let me try to synthesize. Although we don't have all day, and Nouns could really take all day to dive into for real.
Yeah.
What I will say is that like Nouns is this really interesting project that was launched by Punk 4156 and a group of 9 other amazing individuals who are some technical, some artists. And they came together with this idea, like instead of just throwing, monkey pictures or animal pictures and printing out 10,000 of them and taking the money and running like most NFT projects were doing in 2021, the idea was like, what if we took a more intentional approach and only had one noun NFT randomly generated and born every day forever. And so this auction kind of one a day forever protocol was developed, and it became like this primitive that has been used many times since, including most recently by QR, which is your project. And that's really cool to see that primitive has kind of had this stickiness. And I think the primitive itself, what the promising part of it is that when you grow a community that slowly and intentionally with only one new member joining every day, you don't get that that rush of everybody in the Discord and everybody saying when moon and everybody stepping and trampling all over each other to try to make a buck. You get a much more organic community of on-chain friends that kind of develops over time. The other side of it, though, is that because it's a true decentralized DAO, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, because it really is decentralized and like everything is voted on-chain and there's really no top-down control in Nouns, it means that like everything is emergent. So all the values, all of what Nouns funds and doesn't, all of what it considers to be important and doesn't, is all emergent based on who owns the Nouns and who's active in the community. And so over the last 4 years, there's been basically, we call them seasons colloquially in the Nouns community. And it's just like, there's just these different seasons that come and go of different priorities and different things that have happened. And honestly, it would take hours for us to sit down and go through everything that's happened in all of these seasons. The most recent season is sort of characterized by a group of whales from Singapore who are interested in the Nouns meme, but have maybe a different vision than what a lot of us used to think of when they think of Nouns. And they kind of want to turn Nouns into, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but I had a call with one of them who was a very, very kind person. And we had a really great conversation. But he just talked to me about his vision for Nouns, which was like to turn it into like an incubator sort of thing where, people could get, funded for tech or art projects, but there has to be like some path to sustainability or ROI. And I think those are noble goals, and I totally understand where they're coming from. But I also think that like some of the magic of Nouns gets lost when you focus on some of those elements versus trying to focus on the mimetic elements of Nouns, which are really important.
Mhm.
Caveat being that like, the price has been down only since the beginning. So like the theory that you could just sort of make a meme that would eventually return, real value back to the treasury, like ROI to the treasury via attention, hasn't really proven out. And I think it's maybe okay for a really great experiment to sometimes not turn out the way that you wanted it to. But I guess in my camp, I would almost rather see people still love Nouns for what it was and for what it stood for, and even see the treasury go to zero if that's the case, so long as it's funding like earnest people and builders and keeping things weird and doing things that other kind of bodies of funding wouldn't necessarily fund. That's my vision of Nouns. And so I don't actually feel super aligned with where Nouns is at right now, if I'm honest. And I know a lot of other people feel that way, but that's just the current chapter of Nouns, and who knows what the future could hold.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It sort of it gets to this concept that I've thought about a good amount when it comes to crypto, which is that like there's so many of these things that whether it's an NFT collection or a meme coin or whatever it might be, that there's like this, I mean, with like a company, for example, like you start a company, the expectation is like it, if it's successful, it'll be around for a very long time and like sort of like in perpetuity, even
Yeah.
though the reality is like companies die eventually or, get acquired or something. Like they don't, they do, it is like sort of it's not a, forever thing. But with crypto, this is like magnified because so many things that get so much attention for, we talked about the other day, hours, days, maybe sometimes weeks, even more rarely months, and most rarely years. These things like sort of come and go. And so like I've sort of thought about like, do we need to sort of like rethink how we're treating some of these things to make it such that, success can be defined by like, for example, with a meme coin, like, there's all these meme coins that go way up and then way down. And obviously there are some that have been able to hold some value. Obviously, like Dogecoin being the OG, but even, you know, some of these newer ones like Dog with Hat or whatever went to like, I don't know, 3 billion or something. And now it's like at a billion or something like that. Like that's, I mean,
Yeah.
a billion is like a, you know, yeah, it's down, you know, 67% or whatever it is, but like $1 billion of value in a Dog with Hat.
For a dog with a hat. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, it's crazy. So it's like, you know, some of these things do persist to some degree, or at least have over months and years.
Yeah.
But like, I do think there's maybe like room for like, you know, like it basically doesn't need to be a forever thing. And so like Nouns, for example, I was wondering as you were telling the story, I was like, I wonder what would have happened if they did the same exact thing that they did, but with an end date, like whether it was 10,000 or, you know, 1,000 or whatever it might have been.
Keep in mind that 10,000 will take like 20 years already. So.
Yeah, so it's practically forever, basically. So maybe like 1,000, I don't know, but I sort of wonder if they considered that as they were sort of thinking through the structure. Because whenever you do something forever, it's like eventually, you know, if this thing's coming in every day, it's like roughly like an infinite supply in the ultimate, you know, in the fullness of time, and like that just feels like something where like the value kind of has to go down over time. But
at the same time, like every cohort of Nouners has the ability to turn the auction off. It's never happened before. Every time it gets suggested, it gets, you know, turned down pretty quickly, because like people consider one a day to be a huge part of the meme. And I think it is, but like there is something interesting about like saying one a day forever, but then also putting all the power to alter that or change that into the power of the people who own the tokens.
Interesting.
Kind of meta about that in a way.
Yeah, interesting. I didn't realize that. So that is there is an off button.
Yeah, and I mean, there's anything, literally anything about the protocol can be changed by the protocol. Yeah,
that feels like something that like you might be interested, given what like you sort of speak about it almost nostalgically, that like you don't want a tremendous amount more out of it. You just sort of love what it's been and would like for that to be like somewhat preserved. And I think this is probably how, you know, for example, like punks holders will think about punks. Like they're not trying to build a metaverse. They're just like punks are punks, and I love what it is.
I got a little in my feelings the other day and posted on Warpcast about Nouns, and I basically kind of was drawing a little bit on like the book The Giver, and just talking about how like we've received all this weirdness, chaos and connection and conflict, and we've carried it forward, tasked with protecting it from the encroaching sameness. And maybe one day we'll be able to give the gift back to the world, like you know, like what happens in that book. But for now, it just kind of feels like, for me anyway, like holding Nouns, or whatever Nouns was to me or is to me, like inside, and like this is kind of what the meme means to me. And in the future, maybe it'll still mean something like that to other people, but maybe it won't. Maybe it'll be just completely different.
Right. You know, I think that makes a lot of sense. So I know we don't have like a ton of time, and I did want to cover like a couple more bases. Zero Rights Media, ZEROPOD. What's the origin story there?
Yeah, I can give you sort of the quick history on that. So in 2022, I founded an organization, a collective called the Noun Square, with a bunch of my friends from Nouns. And our basic idea was to, first of all, host a daily spaces on Twitter that would sort of just celebrate the daily auction of Nouns and kind of make it a moment for the internet. That was kind of the genesis of this whole thing. And then also just to become like a community hub for Nouns. Like Nouns was thriving at the time. There was so many projects that were active, that were using the code, using the art. At one point, a few months after founding, we were running something like 45 spaces a week for all different Nouns projects. It was just a crazy, wild time. I look back on that time with a lot of fondness. It was really fun. We did that for 1,000 shows in a row. We just recently, like earlier this year, stopped doing the daily show at number 1,000. So 1,000 days in a row, our team did a space about Nouns, which was pretty cool. Sort of that leads into earlier this year when we decided to rebrand and kind of reframe what we were doing, and kind of lean in really hard into video content and what had been working really well. So me and Jack Wilds, who had been working together at the Noun Square, kind of spun off into Zero Rights Media. And the idea with Zero Rights is essentially just to be, you know, a zero copyright media organization for the Ethereum ecosystem and sort of all the aligned ecosystems. And so we just like creating content about different interesting projects that are happening on Base and Nouns, you know, in other Ethereum ecosystems. ZeroPod I've been running now since last August, so not quite as many pods as what you've done with with Pod of Jake and Purple People, but it is a video pod. It's pretty intensive on the editing side, so it's a lot of work, but it's been really worth it. And yeah, I mean that's kind of the backstory on both the Noun Square and coming into Zero Rights and what we're doing with that and ZEROPOD. And then also Jack is just a super amazing, talented content creator, video creator, artist to work with. And I really love the way that he is able to synthesize difficult projects, difficult concepts, and just make them really approachable for people. And also how he's just such a good storyteller and helps to tell the stories of the people behind these protocols in the videos that we make. So that's kind of alongside with Betterment, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit. That's my main focus now in the space, is just trying to see if it's possible to run, a profitable, sustainable on-chain media organization that makes content that people really, want to watch and look forward to watching.
Yeah, it's super cool. Like, given what we were just talking about, how like things don't need to be forever to wrap on the thousandth episode is like,
yeah,
exactly. I mean, it takes 1,000 episodes to get to 1,000 episode milestone. Like you could do it on 500, but it wouldn't be quite as cool. Like 1,000 is so much work, and like to just be like, we're coming up on it, and we feel like the time is sort of come. Like just like a really clean. Like I think there's just something to be said for having an end to something, and to be able to look back on it and be like, yep, like that was like we sort of did that the right way and ended it at the right time. Yeah, exactly. Versus the other, the other sort of, sorry to interrupt, but the other sort of like alternative is like it whatever it is just sort of fizzles outside of your control, like inevitably, whatever it is, in the ultimate, like maybe it could even exist beyond one's lifetime or whatever, but like ultimately either sort of like ended on purpose or it just sort of like ends, on its own or whatever, by like fizzling out or whatever. So out of curiosity, how did you meet Jack?
So Jack, that's an interesting backstory too. So this goes back to pretty early Nouns days as well. Like I want to say late 2021. No, it couldn't have been that early actually. No, sorry. So it must have been like mid 2022, because it was after the Noun Square started. But I heard a podcast that he put out. He used to be part of a collective that was actually called Collective, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. But he was part of a collective that was building a governance client for Nouns at the time called House of Nouns. And he and his partner were commissioned to do this podcast essentially about what was happening in Nouns and different props and stuff. He posted it in the Nouns Discord at the time, and I listened to it, I swear, for like 5 minutes. I'm like, holy shit, this guy is one of the best storytellers I've ever heard. And this was just like 5 minutes into a podcast about Nouns, but I was just like captivated by the way he like hooked me and like was telling the story. And I literally stopped listening to the podcast. I went on Discord. I was like, I messaged this guy. I said, add me. I add him. I said, look, we have to work together. I don't know how, but like maybe can we like repost your podcasts on the Noun Square and help you get more distribution for it? Like, how can we kind of work together? And like, that's just when we started collabing on things. And then over time, he ended up leaving that organization. And so we ended up like funding them through the Noun Square to keep doing those podcasts. And then he started doing other content for us. And like the rest is history is kind of a cliched thing to say. But that's just when we started working together and kept working together. And an interesting thing about this lore too is that just recently I was at FarCon, and it was, a lot of people were surprised to hear that it was the first time that Jack and I had ever met in person after working together online on chain for 2 years. We'd actually just never met each other. We never were at the same events. We don't live anywhere near each other. And it was our first time meeting at FarCon like a month ago, which is crazy.
Yeah, it is interesting. And like, it's so nice. Like it's a good story, and just hearing like, sort of you stumble upon someone, and, I did a tweet about or a cast about this the other day. It's like an obvious thing, but you don't think about it very often. But as I was sort of like scrolling my phone, I just sort of like realized you don't even read your feed by default. Like you scroll past something, you don't read it, you just scroll. And then like if something captures your attention, which like is a relatively low bar, you'll read the tweet, and then, the default, if you've gotten to that point, is you don't do anything else. And then it really needs to sort of like strike some chord. I think like all this stuff is like super minor. So like you're not like actively thinking about it, but like if you decide to like it, like it was sort of like a level beyond what stopped you to just read it, where you were like, oh, I should, I'm going to like that or whatever. And then obviously like recast and so on, comments, whatever. And so I just think it's interesting, like you're in this Discord or like actually you weren't in the Discord, you're watching this content and you see Jack And like, there's enough there, like with what he's doing, that you stop the video, go to the Discord, and reach out to the guy. It's just like very cool when people sort of identify something that they vibe with like that hard, or in this case, they
Yeah.
discover someone who they just are like, man, really like to work with this person. And then like, here we are, you know, and you've been working with them for years.
I've always been like
it's
that.
just,
Though. Like in all the businesses I've had in my life, I've had past partners, and my wife have said to me like, "Why are you spending? You know, why are you?" They'd be like, "Oh, why do you constantly do business with people that you're friends with?" And it can be sometimes an issue. But I think the reason why I do that is because I like to do business with. I like to work with people that I just have a good vibe with. Like, you know what I mean? Like I meet people. I'm like, okay, there's ways that we could collaborate. I love that, and that's just the way I've always operated first and foremost. And it's not like cold and calculated, but it I think works for a lot of things.
yeah. And it's kind of, you know, cheesy, but basically it's just like, there's like few things better than just like sort of discovering a new friend basically out of nowhere,
Yeah.
especially through the internet. I think is very cool. It's something that's been like sort of a new experience for me over the last, like I said, like 4 or 5 years, where previously it was just like within my existing network from like IRL, and now it's more of the reverse direction where I meet people on the internet, and like with you and Jack, you know, you might meet the other person a year or two later or never, and it doesn't really matter that much. So it's been very cool. I have
Mm.
done a relatively poor job of managing our time. I know we have a stop here in
Yeah.
5 minutes, but maybe we can just give people like a little teaser on Betterment for those who are tuning in, given that I know you're spending a lot of time there. I've
This
enjoyed
is a
looking at
good
the app.
experiment, actually. You're like, can you tell me what Betterment is in 5 minutes or less? And I probably can.
Exactly. Elevator pitch.
Well, let me
No
just
pressure
say,
though.
let me just say that Betterment kind of came out of like very naturally and organically out of the other things that I've been focusing on with Zero Rights and continue to focus on with Zero Rights, which is how can creators get paid for their creativity on chain. And a lot of what I was fortunate to learn from Adam Levy and the folks at Blueprint, if you don't know them, go check them out. They have a content accelerator that I was lucky enough to be selected for in their most recent cohort, starting last December and ending in April, I think it was, or March. But they taught us sort of a lot of interesting strategies around how to use tokens and meme coins in contracts to incentivize people's minting behavior, essentially. You can do that through protocols like Boost XYZ and Layer 3. Lots of really interesting ideas and strategies coming out about ways to do that. But I found that when you're using some protocols like Boost, you could do them like you can integrate them with pods.media, for example, which is where I put all of my podcasts. I think you have yours on there as well, if I'm not mistaken, Jake.
Yep, that's right.
That's Team Goated. So you can actually boost them on there, but what happens is like there's no baked in distribution. Like I love the Boost protocol, but it's not a distribution protocol. It's just a very standard Boost protocol. So you could put $1,000 worth of Clanker or $1,000 worth of QR coin or $1,000 worth of Better coin on there, and you could incentivize people perhaps to come and collect their content. But if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around, then it doesn't really matter. So if people don't know that the boost is there, then they won't come and collect it essentially. So the idea with Betterment is like, is it possible to gamify and sort of give like a more temporal, urgent aspect to these types of boosts to make it so that people come to the app or come to the experience once every, so many days or hours or whatever, but they come to it ready to collect and then to be rewarded for the collecting. And that's what Betterment is currently it's running every other day. So Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 3 p.m. EST, 12 p.m. PST. I'd like to get it to a daily cadence at some point, but we're just right now taking it slow and iterating and getting feedback. So every other day, there's a gamer around, and what happens is there's a piece of content on chain that's featured in the app on that day. People will get a notification when the game goes live. They go into the mini app on Farcaster, and they collect the piece of content, or soon it will be art as well, for usually $1 or a little bit more than that. They can use their integrated Farcaster wallet, which is one of the great things about building on Farcaster. They collect it, and then immediately after collecting it and patronizing that creator, they get a little neon wheel pops up, and they can spin the wheel once for each edition that they've minted, and they could win up to 100x back what they spent on the mint in the featured token of that day. So that's kind of the mechanism. Just adds a little bit of dopamine, adds a little bit of risk and reward to the equation for people collecting content. And so far, even though it's only been running for about 2.5 weeks, early data shows that it seems to be popular. People seem to really like it. We've had over 8,000 people install the app in that time. Most of them have notifications on, which is really cool. Because they need to have their notifications on to know when the game happens. So there's an urgency there. And most importantly, the creators that we've featured have just been blown away because they're putting their content in this app, and then like 20 minutes later, the round is over and 900 people have minted their content and they've made like $350 on chain for something. And it's like, wow, that's just such a powerful moment for creators. And you know this as a creator, Jake, it's really difficult to monetize your content on chain. And so that's been a really satisfying piece of it, is like to have creators coming back to me like, when can I do this again? That was crazy. This is more money that I've made from my podcast for the past 2 months in one day. This type of feedback has really, really been nice to hear. And so that's my North Star for Betterment anyways. Like, how can we make it easier and more fun for people to support and patronize creators on chain? And, hoping that also what the content that I create with Zero Rights Media and that Jack creates from Zero Rights Media can kind of leverage what we learn through this app as well.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. And I see how it all sort of, ties together, and you can use it as like sort of your home platform for Zero Rights, but also sort of rent it out to other creators. I think primarily you're doing that to start and just, delighting a lot of creators, to your point. Like, it's just, I mean, as a podcaster specifically, there's obviously different categories of NFT artists and whatever else, but as a podcaster specifically, I know that like podcast, regardless of whether it's crypto or otherwise, just like super hard to monetize. You basically have to be on the power law, left of, audience. And it's just like, by definition, most people aren't there. So, and if you're not there, you might have, go on.
Rachel Wilkins from the Good News Show is one of the creators who's been featured in our app. In fact, she was featured the very first one that we ran. And then after that, she came to me and she said, look, I've got a whole season in the can ready to go. It's 8 episodes. Can we release them all exclusively on Betterment over the next 8 Mondays? And I'm like, all right, let's do it. So we sort of made an agreement in principle for that. But she talked about how she had a podcast previously that was pretty high up on the Spotify rankings, like I want to say top 100,000 or something like this, but it was pretty good for the category. And she had that for years. And, aside from being able to sell some merch here and there, like, she never made a dime from any of that exposure and attention. So for her, it was like, wow, I made more in one 20-minute session on chain here with Betterment than I did for all these years of trying to build a podcast into something meaningful off chain. And that's a pretty good testimonial for the types of tech that we're trying to build here.
Yeah, no, totally. So, people listening, go check out Betterment, check out Toady. If you don't follow him already, I know most of Farcaster already does, but follow him on Twitter as well and whatnot. And mint on Betterment and spin the wheel.
I think we're going to do something meta here too. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but we talked about maybe minting this one as this episode and featuring it on Betterment, which would be a pretty meta experiment. So hopefully we can do that.
Yes, absolutely. Let's do that. Let's get people their rewards, spinning the wheel and whatnot. And that is meta. So you'll be able to access this episode via Betterment soon. So thanks, Toady. Appreciate it.